when you try to locate the single point where Western philosophy truly begins, you land on a man who fundamentally rejected the written word. We are diving into Socrates, born around 470 BC. And this isn't just about a famous name you see on a statue. This is about the architect of moral and ethical inquiry, a man so challenging to his society that his entire colossal legacy was cemented by his judicial murder, forced suicide by drinking hemlock in Athens.
It's the ultimate intellectual mystery, isn't it? The man who demanded that we all examine our lives left no primary source material for us to examine him directly. He inspired, generations of philosophers, yet he produced no definitive, settled doctrine.
So everything we know is secondhand. It's all mediated through the eyes of his friends, his students, his critics, primarily Plato and Xenophon.
Right, and this immediate reliance on posthumous, often conflicting accounts throws us straight into what every single scholar has to deal with, the Socratic problem.
And that's our mission today. We're going to conduct a deep dive into this intellectual enigma. We're going to try to untangle these contradictory sources. You have the comprehensive but sometimes biased student, the dull but practical historian, and the outright hostile comic playwright.
And through all that, try to find the man.
Exactly. We aim to extract the enduring philosophical nuggets from the life he declared not worth living, if left unexamined. We have to examine him through the versions that survived.
Precisely. Because we aren't chasing a single, perfectly documented historical figure, you have to accept that we are studying the rise of an entirely new literary genre, the Socratic dialogue, where authors use Socrates' voice and his character to propagate their own ideas.
So to truly appreciate his legacy, we have to ground the man in his context. 5th century Athens, warts and all.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Who was the Athenian citizen who became this legend? Socrates was born around 470 or 469 BC in the deme of Alipes, which suggests he wasn't some remote wandering ascetic from the start.
No, not at all. The sources paint a picture of moderate affluence. His father, Sophroniskis, was a stoneworker, and his mother, Phinarete, was a midwife.
And that background is really critical to understanding his choices later on, isn't it?
Absolutely. He wasn't poor. He wasn't forced into manual labor. He inherited enough from his father's estate to be financially stable. And that context makes his notorious ascetic lifestyle a profound philosophical statement, not a necessity.
It also probably makes the jokes about his appearance sting a little more, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
The sources are surprisingly detailed about his physical self. We're talking about a man described as famously ugly.
Oh, famously.
No.
A flat, turned-up nose, bulging, prominent eyes, a large belly. He was often compared to a satyr or some kind of deep-sea creature.
A Silenus, right, the grotesque figures.
Yes. His friends, particularly Alcibiades in Plato's Symposium, were ruthless with their descriptions. And this physical difference, coupled with his chosen lifestyle, created this stark, visible contrast to the typical Athenian elite. He just embraced indifference to material pleasures, rarely bathed, walked everywhere barefoot, and owned only one single ragged coat no matter the weather.
So his outward appearance was really a reflection of his inner priorities. But his public life wasn't solely academic. He was an Athenian citizen, which meant he had to perform civic duties, including military service.
Absolutely. And we know he was a distinguished soldier in the Peloponnesian War. He was in 3 significant campaigns, Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. This shows he was committed to the state in principle, but his true character is revealed when he drew this sharp, non-negotiable line between civic duty and personal moral integrity.
That distinction of the moral line he would not cross. That's the essential anecdote that defines his political identity before the trial. It happened during the terrifying violent reign of the 30 tyrants around 404 BC.
The city was in chaos. The oligarchic government, installed after Athens' defeat, summoned Socrates and 4 others to the Tholos, the round public building in the Agora.
And they gave him a direct order?
A direct order. Arrest Leon the Salaminian, a prominent figure, so he could be summarily executed. Socrates and Socrates alone refused.
The sources say he just went home. I mean, that's an astonishing act of defiance. He didn't argue. He didn't debate the law.
He just walked away. He removed himself from the situation, choosing to risk the almost certain retribution of the tyrants and possibly execution, rather than participate in a crime he deemed fundamentally unjust.
It was a fierce adherence to his own moral judgment.
It proved that for him, personal morality trumped fear and political command. This detail is crucial because, ironically, the people who later tried and executed him were the Democrats who replaced those very tyrants.
Which perfectly demonstrates why our study of him is so difficult. How do we reconcile the dedicated soldier, the moral abstainer, and the politically defiant philosopher when all we have are these radically different accounts of the man?
And that difficulty of a reliable historical reconstruction is, as you said, the Socratic problem. We rely predominantly on four main pillars, and they conflict substantially, forcing us to constantly triangulate.
Okay, let's start with the student whose work survived most extensively, Plato.
Plato is comprehensive, but notoriously inconsistent. Scholars debate incessantly where the voice of the historical Socratic Socrates ends and the voice of the developing Platonic Socrates begins.
So he starts putting words in his mouth.
It seems so. In Plato's early dialogues, Socrates primarily uses the method of refutation, the elenchus, and claims ignorance. But in the middle and late dialogues, he starts teaching these complex doctrines like the theory of forms. The consensus is that Plato began putting his own evolved ideas into the mouth of his revered teacher, blurring the boundary between history and intellectual tribute.
Now we have a Xenophon, who was also a contemporary and a student, but he approached the task more as a military historian, not a philosopher.
Right, and Xenophon loved Socrates for his virtue, his courage, his patriotism, yet his account often feels flat and oddly uninspired.
Less philosophical, more practical.
Much more. He portrays a Socrates less focused on existential ethical questions and more on practical mundane concerns, like efficient household management, which he details in the Economicus, and a deep focus on self-control or enkratia. Critics, famously Friedrich Schleiermacher in the early 19th century, attacked Xenophon's depiction, calling his Socrates one of intolerable smugness.
So Xenophon was more interested in defending him than really exploring his philosophy.
It seems that way. His goal, particularly in the Memorabilia, was simply to offer a practical, defensible version of the man to counter the accusations he faced at trial.
So Plato gave us the intellectual giant, and Xenophon gave us the practical, slightly boring uncle. And then you throw in the ultimate wild card, Aristophanes.
Aristophanes was a contemporary dramatist. His 423 BC play, The Clouds, presents this famous, vicious caricature. He ridicules Socrates as an absurd atheist sophist floating in a thinking shop and engaged in ridiculous natural philosophy, trying to measure the distance a flea can jump.
That's fascinating context. While it's certainly satire, the fact that Socrates was prominent enough to be lampooned on stage confirms that he was already a well-known, maybe even annoying public figure long before his trial. He was around 45 at the time.
It absolutely confirms his public presence and the controversy he stirred. And finally, we rely on Aristotle. Now, he wasn't a contemporary, he studied under Plato decades later, but he approached the doctrines with objectivity, synthesizing them as a philosopher.
Right. Aristotle's perspective is crucial because he focused on the doctrines rather than the man.
Exactly. He provides vital synthesis, though his analysis is primarily constrained to what he saw as the genuine early Socratic thought preserved in Plato's first dialogues. Aristotle also coined the term logos Socraticos, the Socratic dialogue, formally recognizing this new literary genre that sprang up after Socrates' death.
So the scholarly headache of reconciling these four pillars led to a massive shift in the 19th and 20th centuries. The initial confidence in reconstructing the real Socrates just crumbled.
It started when Schleiermacher rejected Xenophon as too naive. Later in the 20th century, Carl Joel argued that Socratic dialogues were essentially fictional, that authors were simply using the Socratic character traits as a dramatic vehicle.
And this skepticism led directly to the position held by figures like Dupreil and Gigon, that the core mission is futile. We have to stop trying to find the single historical Socrates.
We have to shift the focus from reconstruction to interpretation. The Socratic problem is largely deemed unsolvable because the texts are works of philosophy and literature, not journalistic biographies. Therefore, we focus on studying the enduring, contradictory versions of his character and, critically, the philosophical tools he gave us that transcend the biographical uncertainty.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the identity of the man is blurred by biography, the method he employed is sharp and undeniable. The engine driving his pursuit of truth is the Socratic Method, or elenchus. Let's define this clearly for you, the listener.
Elenchus translates roughly to refutation or cross-examination. It is a dynamic process conducted entirely through dialogue, short questions, and answers. It is designed to expose inconsistencies within the beliefs of the person Socrates is speaking to. It's an intellectual wrestling match, not a classroom lecture.
I think the key distinction here is that he wasn't trying to sell you his doctrine. He was trying to dismantle yours.
Precisely. The typical progression is brutal in its elegance. Socrates finds someone who claims to be an expert in something, say, a politician claiming to know justice, or a general claiming to know courage. Socrates asks them for a definition of the core concept. He then uses their subsequent answers to lead them to a contradiction, demonstrating that their initial definition is untenable because it conflicts with their other strongly held beliefs.
And the conclusion is always the same. The alleged expert did not truly know what they thought they understood in the first place. This must have been deeply irritating to the Athenian establishment.
Incredibly so. He used elenchus to place serious doubt on mainstream opinion, revealing not only his interlocutor's ignorance, but also reinforcing his own famous claim of ignorance. This is why his insistence on the priority of definition was so important.
Tell us more about that priority. Why did he insist on defining a concept first?
Well, he was working in a climate dominated by sophists, who were masters of rhetoric and relativism, challenging the very meaning of virtue and knowledge. Socrates saw that if you couldn't even agree on the basic definition of justice, how could you possibly claim to practice it? He wanted to clear the air, demanding a clear definition, gathering examples of piety, for instance, and then finding the single essential characteristic they all shared before any ethical discussion could proceed. He sought a bedrock understanding against the shifting sands of sophistic rhetoric.
But this method itself has been scrutinized by modern scholars. If elenchus only reveals internal contradictions, can it actually establish truth?
That's the crux of the academic debate. Gregory Vlastos famously claimed that elenchus is a purely negative tool. It can show that a person's beliefs are inconsistent, but it cannot establish the truth or falsehood of the original proposition. This inability to establish positive truth creates a massive rift in modern interpretation.
So on one side, you have the constructivists who argue that the method does ultimately help Socrates reach affirmative moral statements.
Yes, they argue that by eliminating false definitions, you narrow the field until a true definition is all that remains. But the other side, the non-constructivists, argue that Socrates is genuinely just trying to establish inconsistency, and that the final conclusion is simply, you thought you knew, but you were wrong. The brilliance is that Socrates leaves you with a moral and intellectual responsibility to keep searching.
That search leads us directly to the most famous and most challenging phrase associated with the man, the paradox of knowing nothing.
I know that I know nothing. This is Socratic ignorance, often referred to as his profession of aporia, perplexity, or bafflement. Plato's Socrates frequently makes this claim, particularly concerning major ethical concepts like impiety or virtue, because he denies having definitive knowledge of their true nature.
But here is the massive puzzle, the intellectual contradiction that we have to grapple with. How can a man who claims to know nothing also confidently state specific absolute moral truths?
Exactly. I mean, look at the apology. While he is defending himself, he says, but that to do injustice and disobey my superior, God or man, this I know to be evil and base. That sounds like absolute, unquestionable certainty. If he knows nothing, how does he know that?
It creates a Socratic inconsistency that required scholars like Vlastos to propose these really elaborate solutions. We need to detail this because it's a brilliant way to try and resolve the contradiction.
Vlastos proposed semantic dualism, that Socrates operated with two separate functional meanings of the word knowledge. There is knowledge-C, or certain knowledge, which is systematic, fully certain, and unquestionable understanding, like a mathematical proof. This is the knowledge he genuinely denies having. And then there is knowledge-E, which is elenchus-derived understanding, a lower level, often negative cognition based on successfully testing opinions.
So he was being truthful when he denied having the mastery of the knowledge C of the entire systematic concept of virtue, but he could accept possessing a reliable, tested understanding knowledge E that acting unjustly is evil.
Right. He knew that particular truth with sufficient confidence because it survived repeated elenchus. It's an elegant solution designed to save Socrates from self-contradiction, but you do have to ask, is it intellectually honest? Are we just trying to save him?
It feels a little like a patch.
It can. Most scholars agree that while Vlastos' solution is technically brilliant, Socrates' primary goal, regardless of the knowledge distinction, was pedagogical. Acknowledging ignorance is the necessary first step toward true wisdom. It forces the interlocutor to engage.
And this dynamic brings us to the third core tool, which is often used to mediate this paradox of ignorance, Socratic irony.
Irony is integral to his character, particularly in Plato's depictions. It is subtle, often humorous, and typically involves flattery or feigned admiration that leaves the audience, and sometimes the person he's speaking to, genuinely wondering if he is serious.
The classic example you mentioned is Euthyphro. Socrates runs into Euthyphro, who is prosecuting his own father for murder and claims superior knowledge of divinity and piety. And Socrates launches into this intense, over-the-top flattery.
Yes, declaring that Euthyphro must be far progressed in wisdom to undertake such a sensitive moral duty, and that Socrates himself must become Euthyphro's student. The irony there is so thick you could cut it with a knife. He's acknowledging the audacity and potential moral horror of the act while pretending to be overwhelmed by Euthyphro's spiritual authority.
So why use it? The Hellenistic interpretation saw it as simple playfulness, a rhetorical trick to keep the audience engaged.
But the deeper philosophical interpretation is that irony serves as a concealment. It cloaks his profound philosophical messages, making them accessible only to those reflective enough to spot the sarcasm and look for the underlying truth. It is a necessary philosophical filter. If you take the flattery literally, you are simply a fool. If you grasp the concealed criticism, you have begun to think critically.
So in a way, Vlastos's concept of double-meaning irony applies here too. Socrates could be ironic when denying a simple, low-level piece of information, but utterly serious when denying the high systematic knowledge of ethical matters.
That layering is why engaging with Socrates is always an active intellectual exercise, never passive reading.
Okay, let's shift our focus from method to core belief. Everything we've discussed, the refutation, the relentless self-examination, it all seems to circle back to the desire for one goal, eudaimonia, which is often inadequately translated as happiness, but it's better understood as flourishing or living well.
That's the central motivator. For Socrates, the pursuit of eudaimonia is the direct or indirect force behind every single human action. And he fundamentally linked achieving eudaimonia to knowledge and virtue. This leads us to Socratic intellectualism,
which is the radical claim that all virtue is based on knowledge, culminating in that famous controversial maxim, no one errs willingly.
This is perhaps his most challenging proposition. Socrates believed that every person pursues what they perceive to be good. So if a person acts wrongly, they are not suffering from a failure of moral character or willpower, they are suffering from a deficiency of intellect. They simply lack the knowledge of what is truly good for them.
Which means he outright discounted the possibility of a crazy weakness of will, or acting against one's own better judgment because of irrational passions. Most of us experience a crazy daily. We know we shouldn't eat the cake, but we do it anyway. Socrates says that's impossible.
He argues in dialogues like Gorgias and Meno that if you truly knew with absolute certainty that eating the cake was detrimental to your eudaimonia, to your ultimate flourishing, your soul, which seeks only the good, would choose against it.
So why do you eat it?
The reason you eat it is because you have made an intellectual calculation, however faulty, that the immediate sensory pleasure is a greater, albeit temporary, good than the long-term virtue of self-control. It's an error in calculating the good, not a failure of will.
That is a staggering claim because it places the entire responsibility for moral actions squarely on rationality. It minimizes the role of passion, irrational desire, and external temptation.
And it leads logically to the unity of virtue. Since all virtues, courage, justice, piety, are simply forms of knowledge, they must essentially be one unified body of understanding. If you understand what the good is, you automatically possess all the virtues. For example, he uses courage in the Protagoras to show that true courage isn't recklessness, but knowledge of which dangers are truly worth confronting. Knowledge enables virtue.
This relentless emphasis on internal intellectual self-examination inevitably put him in deep conflict with a fragmented, ritual-based ancient Greek religion.
Oh, absolutely. His religious nonconformity was a primary factor in his demise. Ancient Greek religion was based heavily on civic duty, festivals, and ritual sacrifices intended to appease or gain favor from the anthropomorphic pantheon. Socrates' critique, particularly in Euthyphro, was profound. He argued that sacrifices seeking transactional reward were useless acts of self-interest.
Instead, he argued that the only true way to worship the gods was through philosophy, through the relentless pursuit of knowledge and moral refinement. He demanded self-examination over traditional forms of piety.
And he redefined the nature of the divine itself. He argued that the gods must be inherently wise, just, and good, which completely contradicts the petty, vengeful, and often contradictory nature of the traditional Olympian pantheon.
This brings us to the famous Euthyphro dilemma, which is still studied today as a cornerstone of theological ethics.
The dilemma asks, is something good because the god wills it, or does the god will it because it is good? If you choose the first option, then morality is arbitrary. God could command murder and it would be good. If you choose the second, then goodness exists independently of God, and even God is subject to it. Socrates clearly favored the second position, suggesting goodness and piety were independent, and the gods, being inherently wise, would naturally choose what is good.
It's important to note, despite the charges of atheism, he wasn't claiming there were no gods. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, he even affirms the existence of a creator through intelligent design.
Yes, the teleological argument he constructs is surprisingly detailed. He claims that specific features in the universe, particularly those related to human utility, our eyes, our eyelids, our very structure, exhibit undeniable signs of forethought. This implies an omniscient, omnipotent divine creator who designed the universe specifically for humankind's benefit and advance.
This creator sometimes seems to be a single deity, and other times he refers to gods, plural.
And scholars interpret this in a few ways. Either he believed in a supreme deity who commanded the others, or that the multiple gods of the pantheon were simply manifestations or agents of a single rational divine force. Either way, his divinity was rational and moral, which was the opposite of the traditional chaotic Athenian pantheon.
But the most personal and controversial aspect of his spirituality, the one that directly fed the impiety charge, was his inner voice, the daimonion.
The daimonic sign was an inner divine voice that Socrates claimed to hear from childhood, and its function was incredibly specific. It only ever acted as a deterrent. It stopped him from a course of action he was about to take. It never gave him positive advice or commanded him to do something.
That's a crucial detail that often gets overlooked. It was purely a brake. And because he claimed this inner voice had a novel, divine origin, his accusers seized on it as concrete evidence supporting the charge of Asabia impiety, the introduction of new gods.
And modern scholarship, having seen the spectrum of psychological phenomena, has struggled to label this. Interpretations range widely. Was it a genuine, rational source of moral knowledge? A powerful, almost instinctive impulse? A warning delivered through a recurring dream? Or even a genuine paranormal experience connected to his ascetic lifestyle?
If we approach this from a critical perspective, isn't it a bit anachronistic to assume a philosophical giant relied on a literal mystical voice for guidance?
It might be. Mark McFerrin, for example, suggests that Socrates actually interpreted every divine sign, including the daimonion, through secular rationality for confirmation, essentially making the sign the starting point for elenchus. A.A. Long takes an even broader view, arguing that in the 5th century BC, the religious and rational realms were not nearly as separated as we assume today. For Socrates, a moral conviction driven by an intense internal feeling could easily be interpreted as a divine sign, because morality and divinity were intrinsically linked to the health of the soul.
This public, relentless, and divinely sanctioned self-examination was simply too much for Athens to tolerate. The ultimate consequence was the trial and condemnation in 399 BC. This is where philosophy turns into political martyrdom.
The environment was extremely volatile. The trial occurred just 5 years after the restoration of democracy following the brutal reign of the 30 tyrants. The city was looking for stability and for scapegoats. The charges leveled by Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon were deadly serious, corrupting the youth in Asaba in piety.
And his defense, captured so vividly by Plato in the Apology, is one of the greatest pieces of legal oration in history. How did he respond to the corruption charges?
He argued it was illogical. He claimed he never intentionally corrupted anyone, maintaining that if he corrupted others, he risked being corrupted in return, which would be undesirable and irrational. Furthermore, he argued that the youth were not corrupted by doctrine, but by witnessing his constant refutations of the city's established authorities, his very method was deemed corrupting.
But his defense was more of an offense against the city's intellectual laziness, wasn't it?
Absolutely. He famously proclaimed he was God's gift to Athens, a stinging gadfly sent to awaken the city from its moral and intellectual slumber. He warned them that condemning him would hurt Athens far more than it would hurt him, asserting that seeking wisdom and improving the soul was superior to the pursuit of money or status. He was essentially telling the jury that they were about to destroy the best thing they had.
Despite the powerful defense, he was convicted by a relatively close majority vote. But then came the sentencing phase, where he was allowed to propose an alternative penalty. He refused exile outright, seeing it as abandoning his philosophical mission.
And his counterproposal was sheer audacity. He seriously proposed free state meals and housing, a high civic honor usually reserved for Olympic victors, as payment for his public service. When pressed, he grudgingly offered a fine of 1 mina of silver, an amount that just insulted the jury. His conduct during the sentencing was interpreted as arrogant defiance, pushing the jury to choose the death penalty by drinking hemlock.
So he spent his last days in prison, and in Crito we read the famous account of his friends offering him a straightforward way to escape, which he steadfastly refused.
He refused on profoundly philosophical grounds detailed in the dialogue. He argued that the citizen, by staying in the city, implicitly agrees to the social contract, the city's authority and laws. To escape would be to break that agreement, which would be an injustice. His last public act was an absolute embodiment of adherence to the law.
But before we discuss his political legacy, we have to address that long-running academic debate. Was the trial primarily religious persecution, or was it a political hit job disguised as piety?
Both theories are highly plausible. The religious argument points to the legal focus on asabia, the failure to worship traditional gods, and the introduction of his controversial daimonion. It's a clean legal case. However, many known atheists were tolerated in Athens, which suggests religion was the vehicle, not the ultimate destination.
And the political theory argues that he was a profound, open threat to the newly restored democracy. He was openly critical of democratic procedures, and his associations with anti-democrats like Chrysius, one of the 30 tyrants in Alcibiades, made him politically toxic.
And the modern consensus is that the two motives are inseparable. In ancient Athens, religion and the state were not distinct entities. Accusations of impiety could easily be politically fueled, especially because the general amnesty following the rule of the tyrants made prosecuting overtly political crimes difficult. So Socrates' political enemies used the clear, undeniable religious deviance, his daimonion and non-traditional views on the gods, as the legal mechanism to eliminate a perceived political threat.
Regardless of motive, his legacy is that of the philosophical politician, despite never seeking office. He criticized democracy not because he opposed people power, but because he opposed its mechanism.
He criticized democratic procedures, such as voting by lot and rhetorical persuasion, seeing them as misleading the public and allowing ignorant men to lead. His definition of true politics was entirely moral and internal. It wasn't about statecraft in the traditional sense. It was about shaping the moral landscape of the city through philosophy and improving citizens' souls. This was his highest form of service to Athens.
And his ultimate political statement lies in the paradox of his final acts. On the one hand, his refusal to escape prison, detailed in Crito, embodies the acceptance of the law and the state's authority.
That's the core of the social contract argument. He felt he owed the state obedience for raising him and allowing him to live there. But here is the critical nuance we cannot forget. Years earlier, he defied the state when the 30 tyrants ordered him to commit an injustice. He held firm to the principle: one ought never act unjustly, even to repay a wrong that has been done to oneself.
So if the law commands virtue, we obey. If the law commands injustice, we resist. This leads some scholars to identify him as the first proponent of civil disobedience, a belief that citizens should follow state orders unless, after careful internal reflection, they deem them fundamentally unjust. His life and death prove that principle. The moment Socrates died, his influence exploded. He fundamentally shifted philosophy's focus from cosmology and natural science to human affairs and ethics. He didn't just inspire Plato, he inspired nearly every subsequent school of thought: Platonism, the Lyceum, the Cynics, the Stoics.
And this immediate widespread influence caused massive divergence because he left no fixed doctrine. His followers took disparate elements of his life and teachings and magnified them. We see this immediately with the Cyrenaic split, which is just shocking in its contrast.
On one hand, you had Aristophanes, the founder of the Cynics, who took Socratic austerity to the absolute extreme. They embraced materialism and poverty, holding profound contempt for material goods, asserting that virtue alone was the path to eudaimonia. Diogenes, the philosopher in the barrel, is the most famous example of this lineage.
And then pulling a complete philosophical U-turn, you have Aristippus, the founder of the Cyrenaic school, who twisted Socratic principles into a doctrine of radical hedonism. He endorsed the accumulation of wealth and a luxurious life centered on immediate physical pleasures.
How can the same teacher inspire both extreme asceticism and extreme luxury?
The connection lies in epistemology. Aristippus retained the Socratic emphasis on internal certainty. He claimed we can only be certain of our own immediate present feelings and sensations, that is, the pleasure or pain of the moment. He combined this skepticism with the Socratic focus on happiness, defining happiness only as the sum of momentary physical pleasures. He took the methodological doubt of Socrates and applied it to justify a life of excess. That paradox-austere method leading to luxurious conclusion is why the split is so important.
The intellectual battle continued centuries later between the Stoics and the academic skeptics, both claiming Socrates as their true founder.
The Stoics revered him, applying the Socratic method to eliminate inconsistencies and focusing on knowledge-based ethics as the core path to virtue and happiness. They emphasized virtue as sufficient for eudaimonia.
But the academic skeptics, who arose 80 years after Plato's death, championed Socratic ignorance. They argued that because certainty is impossible, the only honest philosophical position is suspension of judgment. The Socratic claim, "I know that I know nothing."
And the irony is that the Stoics accused the skeptics of taking Socratic irony literally, arguing that the true Socratic message was one of knowledge, and the ignorance claim was just a rhetorical trick. The skeptics, conversely, accused the Stoics of abandoning the Socratic demand for critical doubt.
And he had outright antagonists. Not everyone saw him as a hero.
Certainly not. The Epicureans, for instance, criticized him fiercely, particularly for superstition, attacking his belief in the daimonion and his reverence for the oracle at Delphi. They saw his reliance on the divine as irrational in their materialistic view of the universe. The Pyrrhonists also attacked him, accusing him of using his feigned ignorance as mock humility and being an ethical plater, someone who talks endlessly without committing to a fixed, defensible position.
Let's jump forward to the medieval period. How did a pagan philosopher survive and thrive in monotheistic intellectual cultures?
In the Islamic Middle East, he was hugely influential. He was hailed as a great sage for perfectly aligning his ethics with his lifestyle. However, to integrate him into the Islamic theological framework, his doctrines were necessarily altered. He was often portrayed as arguing explicitly for monotheism and for rewards in the afterlife, essentially reshaping him to fit a prophetic monotheistic mold.
And the Renaissance brought two competing, highly secularized narratives back to Europe, led by the humanists and the Neoplatonists.
The humanists, particularly figures like Leonardo Bruni and Genoza Manetti, wanted a secular, civic, republican philosopher to defend human dignity outside of purely Christian dogma. They presented Socrates as the model Athenian citizen.
And to achieve that, they had to actively censor the source material.
They absolutely did. They systematically removed controversial elements like references to his pederasty or the detailed accounts of the daimonion in order to align him with contemporary Christian morality and support the humanist goal of defending a non-sinful, civic way of life.
In opposition, the Neoplatonists, led by Marsilio Ficino, chose the mystical route, portraying a much holier, almost Christ-like figure.
Ficino viewed Socratic ignorance not as an intellectual lack, but as profound humility, a necessary step for receiving divine insight. For them, the daimonion wasn't a psychological quirk, but proof of a direct, God-given wisdom and connection to the divine.
As we move into the modern era, Socrates becomes less a figure of history and more a battleground for ideological movements, starting with German idealism and Hegel.
Hegel celebrated Socrates because he believed Socrates introduced the principle of free subjectivity, the idea of self-determination, and the individual's right to stand against unexamined tradition. Hegel saw this as a monumental turning point in human history, shifting morality from external custom to internal reflection.
But didn't Hegel perform the strange maneuver of justifying the execution?
He did. Hegel argued that while Socrates' individualism was historically necessary, it was also destructive to the existing social order, which he called Sittlichkeit, or ethical life. Hegel concluded that the Athenian state, lacking the concept of private individual conscience, was justified in condemning Socrates because his free subjectivity threatened the very existence of the collective structure, a necessary tragedy in Hegel's view.
Then you have the father of existentialism, Søren Kierkegaard, who considered Socrates his true philosophical teacher.
Kierkegaard dedicated his master's thesis to the concept of Socratic irony. He defined Socrates as the pure ironist, arguing that Socrates avoided writing precisely because he understood that a genuine philosophical truth is something you must realize existentially, not something you can receive passively by reading a book. Avoiding a fixed written doctrine was an act of humility regarding his own ignorance and a powerful existential statement.
And finally, the figure who fundamentally changed how we view Greek philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche harbors this deep, complex resentment toward Socrates. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche blames Socrates for the deterioration of authentic Greek culture. He saw the shift towards Socratic rationalism and intellectualism, the idea that reason can solve everything, as the force that destroyed Greek tragedy.
How did Socratic reason kill tragedy?
While Nietzsche conceptualized Greek culture as a balance between the Apollonian order, reason, clarity, and the Dionysian chaos, passion, intoxication, music. He argues that Socrates prioritized rational Apollonian dialogue to the exclusion of the Dionysian art form of tragedy, injecting the absurdity of equating reason, virtue, and happiness into the Greek psyche. For Nietzsche, Socrates was the turning point that signaled the start of European rationalism, a movement that sacrificed vitality for logic.
And the ultimate battle for Socrates' soul came in the post-World War II era, when figures like Hannah Arendt and Karl Popper saw him as an icon of individual conscience against the horrors of totalitarianism.
Arendt, writing about how ordinary people committed monstrous acts, what she called the banality of evil, suggested that Socrates' constant philosophical questioning and self-reflection were necessary political defenses. She argued that the ability to stop and question one's own assumptions, the very core of elenchus, is what prevents thoughtlessness and makes individuals morally accountable.
And Karl Popper championed Socratic individualism as the precursor to his concept of the open society.
Popper championed the radical individualism and freedom of thought demonstrated by Socrates, placing it in stark opposition to what Popper viewed as Plato's later, rigid, and ultimately totalitarian political philosophy. For these thinkers, Socrates became the eternal symbol of the citizen who demands the right to think critically, even when the state commands silence. #outro.
So what does this vast, contradictory history mean for you, the learner trying to gain thorough knowledge today? The ultimate paradox of Socrates is that he remains a fundamental shortcut to wisdom precisely because he forces self-reflection. True learning, as he demonstrated, often starts not by acquiring new facts, but by dismantling the assumptions and inconsistencies in what you thought you already knew.
We've seen him navigate the most treacherous waters between law and conscience, between belief and doubt. He defied the state to object to injustice, yet he respected the state's authority by accepting his penalty. He taught us that knowledge is the key to virtue, yet he claimed he possessed no true knowledge himself.
And this leaves us with a final, provocative Socratic question that endures today. If the unexamined life is not worth living, what is the moral duty of the examined person when the laws of the state are fundamentally unjust? When does civil obedience become an act of moral compromise? And when is civil disobedience necessary for the health and flourishing of the soul? That complex tension is something that demands self-examination long after this deep dive ends.